Berlin, April 1945. Lieutenant William Morrison moves cautiously through rubble-strewn streets with his patrol, clearing buildings in what should be a straightforward mop-up operation. The Wehrmacht has collapsed. The war is won. Then, from a basement window, a Panzerfaust streaks out and transforms his lead Sherman into an inferno. When Morrison's men storm the position, they find their attacker, a trembling boy who looks barely 14, wearing his grandfather's World War I tunic and clutching a weapon he can barely lift. This is what total war actually looks like, not the propaganda version, not the strategic abstraction. This is what happens when a regime decides that ideology matters more than the lives of its own children and elderly. By the final months of World War II, Nazi Germany had scraped the absolute bottom of the barrel and then kept digging, creating the Volkssturm, a militia force that would throw boys as young as 12 and men as old as 60 against the most powerful military machines ever assembled. American and Soviet forces would face an enemy that should have inspired pity, but instead had to be killed because these undertrained, poorly armed civilians had been turned into weapons by a dying regime that refused to surrender. The Volkssturm represents the ultimate expression of a brutal calculation. When professional military strength through conventional arms fails, replace quality with fanaticism and sheer numbers, no matter the human cost. The Nazis believed that ideological fervor could overcome material disadvantage, that 1 million armed civilians defending their homes would accomplish what 3 million dead soldiers could not. They were catastrophically wrong, but not before they condemned hundreds of thousands of Germans to pointless deaths in the war's final months. Let me be precise about the magnitude of this desperation. By September 1944, Germany had lost over 3 million soldiers killed, with another million missing or captured. The Wehrmacht faced a deficit of 714,000 rifles, 58,000 machine guns, and 3,000 mortars. Think about that. Germany was producing more weapons than it had soldiers to use them. Every category of military exemption had been canceled. Factory workers, men with medical conditions, the previously unfit, all had been drafted. Luftwaffe ground crews whose aircraft no longer existed had been re-rolled into infantry. Kriegsmarine sailors whose ships sat idle in port had been given rifles and sent east. And still, it wasn't enough. This is where General Heinz Guderian enters the story. As chief of the German General Staff, Guderian looked at the catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front and made a pragmatic assessment. We need bodies. His proposal in August 1944 was simple: mobilize every remaining man in Germany capable of holding a weapon, create a national militia under Wehrmacht control, and use them to defend German territory. Hitler rejected it initially, not because he thought it was too extreme, but because he didn't think the Wehrmacht could be trusted with this force. The army had become infected with defeatism, filled with generals who spoke of tactical withdrawals and strategic reality. What Hitler wanted was something different. He wanted fanaticism as the organizing principle. This is where Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and head of the party chancellery, saw his opportunity. Bormann proposed not a military force, but a political one, a people's militia directly controlled by Nazi party officials, where ideological indoctrination would be as important as military training. The historical inspiration he seized upon was the Prussian Landsturm of 1813, when Prussian citizens rose up against Napoleon and drove the French from German soil. Never mind that the Landsturm had been composed of men with military experience fighting a numerically inferior enemy. Never mind that this situation was completely different. The propaganda value of the comparison was what mattered. On September 25, 1944, Hitler issued the decree creating the Volkssturm. The name itself was carefully chosen, not Landsturm, which implied military organization, but Volkssturm, people's storm. The language suggested a spontaneous uprising of the German people, a tidal wave that would sweep away Germany's enemies. The decree was sweeping. All men between 16 and 60 capable of bearing arms would serve. They would be organized locally under Nazi party officials, the Gauleiter who controlled each district and the Kreisleiter who ran each county. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, would oversee military training and equipment. The Volkssturm members would have combatant status under international law. The public announcement came on October 18, 1944, with posters printed on red paper with black ink and a black stripe containing a swastika, a format that Germans immediately recognized because it was identical to how the regime announced executions. The symbolism was accidentally perfect. Now let's talk about who actually filled these ranks, because this is where the reality diverged sharply from the propaganda. The Nazis claimed they would raise 6 million men. They never came close. More importantly, the composition of this force revealed exactly how thoroughly Germany had been bled. All the young, fit men were already dead or fighting. What remained fell into three categories: boys from the Hitler Youth, aged 15 to 18, elderly men, many of them World War I veterans now in their 50s and 60s, and a small number of middle-aged men who had somehow avoided previous conscription due to essential war work or medical conditions. The Hitler Youth component is particularly important to understand. These weren't boys playing soldier. They had been systematically indoctrinated for years. From age 10, German boys had been enrolled in the Jungvolk, the junior branch of the Hitler Youth, where they learned to shoot, to march, to follow orders without question. By 1936, membership had been made mandatory. Parents who refused to register their sons faced fines or imprisonment. These boys had literally known nothing but Nazi ideology their entire conscious lives. They had sworn personal oaths of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. They had been taught that sacrifice for the fatherland was the highest possible honor. When the Volkssturm was formed, roughly 10% of its strength consisted of these teenagers. The elderly component presented a different set of characteristics. Many were World War I veterans with actual combat experience from the trenches of the Western Front. They understood military discipline, weapons handling, and the reality of combat. They were also, in many cases, deeply cynical about this new mobilization. They had seen this before, the grand promises, the appeals to patriotism, the certainty of victory. They had watched an entire generation die in the mud of France and Belgium, and now they were being asked to do it again. German civilians began making sardonic jokes. Why is the Volkssturm Germany's most precious resource? Because its members have silver in their hair, gold in their mouths, and lead in their bones. The organizational structure was deliberately decentralized. Each Kreis, a territorial unit roughly equivalent to an American county, would form one battalion of 642 men. This meant 920 battalions across Greater Germany in theory. Each battalion would be subdivided into companies drawn from local Nazi Party chapters. The Gauleiter for each region had enormous power over these units, which dramatically increased the political authority of regional party bosses. This was entirely intentional. The Volkssturm was as much about binding the party elite to the regime's fate as it was about military defense. Command structure was a bureaucratic nightmare that perfectly exemplified Nazi governance. Himmler controlled training and equipment, but not deployment. Bormann controlled political indoctrination and administration. When units actually entered combat, they would come under Wehrmacht command, but only nominally. In practice, three different power structures competed for control, and this jurisdictional chaos severely hampered whatever effectiveness the Volkssturm might have achieved. Training was minimal and inconsistent. Men were required to attend a few hours of instruction on Sunday afternoons and perhaps one evening during the week, whenever they finished their regular work shifts. Remember, these men were not relieved of their civilian jobs. They were factory workers, farmers, civil servants who were expected to maintain economic production while also preparing for combat. The training they received focused on basic rifle drill, anti-tank tactics with the Panzerfausts, and urban defense. Ideological indoctrination took up a substantial portion of this limited time, teaching men about Jewish Bolshevik conspiracies and the need to fight to the last rather than actual combat skills. The weapons situation was absolutely dire and reveals just how bankrupt Germany's strategic position had become. The Wehrmacht itself needed 300,000 new rifles every month, but industry could only produce 200,000. After the Army, the Waffen-SS, and the newly formed Volksgrenadier divisions took their share, nothing remained for the Volkssturm. Bormann announced he would open the Nazi Party's armory to equip the militia. When those doors opened, they found weapons from the 1930s gathering dust. 46,000 pistols, 3,000 hand grenades, 5,000 rifles, enough to equip one battalion, not 1,000,000 men. In desperation, the party actually tried to buy weapons on the Italian black market and failed because they couldn't scrape together enough lira. The regime ordered crash programs to produce cheap weapons specifically for the Volkssturm. The Volkssturmgewehr, a crude stamped assault rifle made by the Gustloff Company, was inaccurate and unreliable, but at least functional. About 25,000 were produced monthly by early 1945. The MP 3008 was essentially a knockoff British Sten gun with a vertical magazine instead of horizontal, only 10,000 manufactured before war's end. What the Volkssturm actually received was a chaotic mix of obsolete German weapons from World War I, Gewehr 98 rifles, and even earlier Gewehr 71S from the 1880s, plus captured weapons from every nation Germany had fought. Soviet Mosin Nagants, French Liebels, Italian Carcanos, Belgian rifles, even British Lee Enfields. This created a logistics catastrophe because different weapons required different ammunition and spare parts were non-existent. The one weapon produced in sufficient quantities was the Panzerfaust. Germany manufactured approximately 1.2 million per month in early 1945. The Panzerfaust was a single-shot disposable anti-tank weapon with a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating any Allied tank's armor. It weighed only 6 kilograms, produced no recoil, and could be fired from any position. For propaganda purposes, it was perfect, the ultimate equalizer that let even a child destroy a Soviet T-34 or American Sherman. In practice, it had severe limitations. Effective range was only 60 meters, which meant the operator had to let an enemy tank approach to point-blank range before firing. The backblast could injure the shooter or anyone nearby. It took enormous courage to use effectively, and that courage was usually rewarded with death. Uniforms were equally improvised. There weren't any officially. Each man wore whatever clothes he owned, plus an armband reading Deutscher Volkssturm Wehrmacht to supposedly grant combatant status under the Hague Conventions. In practice, many units cobbled together a bizarre mix of obsolete German uniforms, World War I gear, Hitler Youth uniforms, SA brown shirts, even captured enemy uniforms dyed gray. Some wore their work clothes, railway workers in their railroad uniforms, firemen in fire department gear. The result was units that looked less like a military force and more like a desperate rabble, which severely undermined morale rather than inspiring confidence. The oath ceremony, held on November 12, 1944, was designed to compensate through ritual and ideology what the Volkssturm lacked in material preparation. In mass rallies across Germany, men raised their hands and swore, "I take this sacred oath before God that I will be unquestioningly faithful and obedient to the great German Reich and Adolf Hitler. I solemnly promise that I will fight boldly for my homeland and die better for sacrificing freedom, thus leaving the social future of my people to the mercy of fate." The phrasing is revealing. Die better for sacrificing freedom. Not fight for freedom, but die for sacrificing it. German civilians were not stupid. They saw what the Volkssturm actually represented. When the war had seemed winnable, the regime had fielded the Wehrmacht, professional soldiers with modern equipment and extensive training. Now, with defeat looming, the regime was sending grandfathers and children with antique rifles. The very existence of the Volkssturm was an admission of desperation that undermined whatever fighting spirit it was supposed to generate. Yet Nazi propaganda tried to reframe this weakness as strength. Joseph Goebbels, whose February 1943 Total War speech had set Germany on this path, portrayed the Volkssturm as the incarnation of the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial community where all class distinctions dissolved in shared blood and soil. Old and young, worker and professional, all would stand together as Germans defending the fatherland. The reality was considerably less inspiring. Many men simply didn't show up for training. Absenteeism ran high. When Allied forces approached, significant numbers of Volkssturm members would quietly slip away, especially in Western Germany. The Eastern territories saw different behavior. Why? Because Soviet atrocities against German civilians were real and widely reported. German propaganda didn't have to exaggerate much. The Red Army's advance into East Prussia in late 1944 had been accompanied by systematic mass rape, murder of civilians, and wholesale looting. German refugees fleeing west brought first-hand accounts. Entire villages had been annihilated. Women from 8 to 80 had been gang-raped repeatedly. Men had been shot on sight or shipped to labor camps in the Soviet Union. This created genuine terror in Eastern German populations and stiffened resistance considerably. When the Allies actually encountered Volkssturm units in combat, the results varied wildly. In the West, against American and British forces, resistance was generally minimal. Most Volkssturm members had no desire to see their towns destroyed in a hopeless last stand. They would make a token show of resistance, then surrender or simply disappear. American commanders reported that elderly Volkssturm men would often approach under white flags, asking what they needed to do to avoid having artillery level their town. The Eastern Front was completely different. Here, Volkssturm units often fought with startling determination, inflicting real casualties on Soviet forces before being annihilated. This wasn't because they were effective soldiers in any conventional sense. It was because they were defending their homes against an enemy they knew would show no mercy, and because Nazi Party officials and SS security squads were present, ready to execute anyone who showed cowardice. The casualty figures tell the story. At Kohlberg, Volkssturm losses exceeded 60%. At Breslau, roughly 1,900 Volkssturm members died in the siege. During the Battle of Königsberg, another 2,400 were killed. At Kustrin, a militia force held out for 2 months against overwhelming Soviet superiority, taking catastrophic casualties. Battalion 25 235th began with 400 men and fought until only 10 remained alive. These weren't tactical victories. They were mass death events where poorly trained civilians were consumed by professional armies. The most famous example of Volkssturm effectiveness was the 115th Siemensstadt Battalion in Berlin. This unit comprised 770 World War I veterans in their 50s, all employees at the Siemens factory, led by experienced officers. Unlike typical Volkssturm units, it had been properly organized with 3 rifle companies, a support company with infantry guns and mortars, and a heavy weapons company with captured Soviet howitzers and a French heavy mortar. When Soviet forces attacked their positions north of Berlin on April 22, 1945, the battalion counterattacked and actually drove them back temporarily. Over the following days, they fought a skilled delaying action, falling back from position to position. By May 2nd, when Berlin fell, the battalion had been reduced from 770 men to 50 rifles and 2 machine guns. 26 men received Iron Crosses. This was held up as proof that Volkssturm units could fight effectively. The reality was that even this exceptional unit, better trained and equipped than any other, had been virtually annihilated, accomplishing nothing strategically significant. American soldiers found the experience of fighting Volkssturm deeply disturbing. Lieutenant Morrison wasn't unique. Across the front, American troops encountered enemies who looked like their own. Fathers and grandfathers, or worse, their younger brothers and sons. The Hitler Youth component was particularly traumatic. These were children who fought with adult intensity and had to be killed. American veterans described the psychological impact of shooting 14- and 15-year-old boys who refused to surrender, who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they believed dying for Hitler was glorious. The Panzerfaust attacks were especially dangerous because they required no particular skill. A child could hide in rubble, wait for a tank to pass, and fire at point-blank range with devastating effect. Soviet tankers reported hundreds of their vehicles destroyed by Volkssturm members with Panzerfausts in the Battle of Berlin. American tank crews learned to stay away from urban areas where possible, or to advance only with extensive infantry support clearing buildings systematically. But here's what you need to understand about the Volkssturm's military impact. It was ultimately meaningless. These units delayed the inevitable by hours or days, not weeks or months. They inflicted casualties, but nothing approaching the level necessary to alter strategic outcomes. The Western Allies and Soviets had such overwhelming material superiority that even fanatic resistance was simply processed and destroyed. Where Volkssturm units fought hard, they died. Where they surrendered or melted away, the front advanced faster. Either way, Germany lost. The real impact was human. Between 80,000 and 175,000 Volkssturm members died in the last months of the war. The exact number will never be known. These deaths accomplished nothing militarily but represented an enormous tragedy for German families. Boys who should have been in school were fed into combat. Men in their 60s who had survived the trenches of World War I were killed in the streets of German cities. And for what? To delay defeat by a few days while Nazi leaders still harbored delusional fantasies of wonder weapons and political splits between the Western Allies and Soviets. The Volkssturm's most significant contribution to the war was actually negative. Its members participated in atrocities that would haunt Germany's reputation. In January 1945, thousands of concentration camp prisoners were evacuated in death marches from camps near Königsberg. When they reached the town of Palmnicken, local Volkssturm leaders were ordered to move the prisoners onward. One leader, Hans Feyerabend, refused, saying he would not permit a massacre. He assigned Volkssturm guards to protect the prisoners from SS and local Nazi party members. Feyerabend committed suicide when he realized he couldn't prevent what was coming. Between January 30th and February 1st, SS guards, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm units murdered between 2,500 and 3,000 prisoners, many of them driven into the Baltic Sea and shot. In April 1945, at Gardelegen, guards force-marching prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp locked 1,000 prisoners in a barn and burned them alive. The guards included Volkssturm members. At Chell, when Allied bombing hit a prisoner transport train, Volkssturm members joined SS, SA, local police, and civilians in hunting down escaped prisoners in nearby woods and shooting them. These atrocities weren't aberrations. They reflected the regime's success in indoctrinating civilians to participate in mass murder. Not all Volkssturm members were perpetrators, of course. Many were simply victims of circumstances, men and boys trying to survive. But the organization they served was fundamentally criminal, and its existence represented the regime's willingness to sacrifice its own people in pursuit of ideological goals. The Battle of Berlin showed the Volkssturm at its most desperate. Approximately 60,000 Volkssturm members defended the city, organized into 92 battalions. About 30 battalions of Volkssturm I, those with some weapons, were sent to forward positions. The rest remained in the inner city without weapons, waiting for arms that never came. They faced 2.5 million Soviet troops equipped with 6,250 tanks and over 40,000 artillery pieces. The outcome was never in doubt. Soviet forces called the last defenders totals, a reference to Germany's total mobilization. They saw Hitler Youth and Volkssturm members still fighting in the rubble as fanatics beyond reason, and they treated them accordingly. Volkssturm members captured by Soviet forces were often shot as partisans, despite their armbands and identification papers. Those who survived combat frequently faced deportation to labor camps in the Soviet Union, where many died. Nazi party officials enforced fighting to the end through terror. SS security squads roamed behind the lines, executing anyone who showed defeatism. Volkssturm members who tried to surrender were hanged from lampposts as examples. In some cases, entire families were executed if a man was found hiding instead of at his post. During spring 1945, thousands of Volkssturm members in regions like Franken were murdered by Nazi party fanatics for refusing to fight a hopeless battle. By the final days, many older Volkssturm members were hiding from both sides, from the Soviets who would kill or capture them, and from Nazi security forces who would execute them for cowardice. Some found cellars and waited for the fighting to pass. Others tried to blend into civilian populations. A few managed to surrender to Western Allied forces, who generally treated them with greater leniency. The contrast in treatment between East and West was stark. American and British forces in Western Germany generally processed captured Volkssturm members and released them quickly, unless specific war crimes were alleged. They were classified as lightly armed conscripts rather than serious combatants. Many were simply told to go home. Soviet forces in the East showed no such mercy. Volkssturm members were viewed as criminals and treated as such. Summary executions were common. Those who survived faced years in Soviet camps, When Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, the Volkssturm simply ceased to exist. There was no formal dissolution, no ceremony. Men took off their armbands and went looking for their families. Many found their homes destroyed, their cities in ruins, their relatives dead or missing. The boys who survived returned to a shattered country where their education had been replaced with indoctrination, where they had been turned into killers before they had a chance to become adults. Alfred Czech, the 12-year-old boy who had been decorated by Hitler for rescuing wounded soldiers, was shot through the lung in combat and spent 2 years in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. He returned home to find his father had been drafted into the Volkssturm and killed in the final weeks of fighting. Wilhelm Hübner, the 16-year-old who had carried messages under fire, survived but spent the rest of his life trying to reconcile his pride in his bravery with the recognition that he had served a monstrous regime. The testimony of the enemy validates the Volkssturm's ultimate failure. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that Volkssturm resistance was troublesome but never dangerous. Marshal Georgy Zhukov noted that the old men and boys fought with courage, but courage without weapons and training is merely waste. British commanders reported being profoundly disturbed by having to kill children and elderly civilians, but noted that it never slowed their advance by more than hours. The most damning assessment came from German military professionals themselves. General Heinz Guderian, who had originally proposed the idea, later wrote that the Volkssturm sacrificed tens of thousands of lives to achieve nothing but a few days' delay, days that Germany could have better used preparing for occupation rather than destruction. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded regular Wehrmacht forces alongside Volkssturm units, recorded, "They died bravely and pointlessly, sacrificed by leaders who cared nothing for German lives, only for their own demented vision of resistance." That is the ultimate truth of the Volkssturm. It wasn't a desperate but noble last stand. It wasn't a people rising up to defend their homeland. It was a regime throwing its own children and elderly into a meat grinder because it refused to accept the reality of defeat. It was ideology elevated above human life. It was the final demonstration that Nazism was fundamentally a death cult that would destroy Germany itself before admitting failure. American soldiers who encountered those boys with Panzerfausts understood something profound in those moments. They were seeing the end result of totalitarianism, where a state's machinery of indoctrination and control could turn children into weapons to be expended. The shock they felt wasn't just at having to kill kids. It was at seeing what a society becomes when it subordinates everything, including the lives of its own children, to ideology and the cult of personality around a single leader. The Volkssturm's legacy is a warning about the cost of total war and totalitarianism. Those boys and old men who died in Berlin's ruins didn't save Germany. They couldn't. All they did was add more bodies to a death toll that had already reached catastrophic proportions. The regime that created them claimed to be defending German civilization. In reality, it was consuming Germany itself in its final death spasms, and the Volkssturm was the instrument of that self-destruction.